In this video, we're going to learn about some of the most powerful functions that Excel has to offer, lookup functions. Specifically, we'll learn about VLOOKUP, XLOOKUP, HLOOKUP, and index/match. These functions are so important to know that often companies looking to hire people that know about Excel will ask specifically about these functions in the interview. As we go through this practice, we'll suppose that we have a student-run company that makes pizzas, and there are about a dozen or so ingredients that they use to make those pizzas. We have this ingredient list from the procurement team. From the purchases that we've made, we have this list here of the day that we purchased an item, what the item was, and how much we purchased. And then you'll want to add in columns here on the side so that we can practice each of these three lookup formulas. Once we have the price per unit, we can calculate the total cost by multiplying that unit price by the quantity that we purchased, so that we can show on our summary sheet to the finance team how much it is that we're spending on a given item and over time. So let's get started with the VLOOKUP formula. If we type in equals VLOOKUP, the V stands for vertical lookup. And so what it needs to know first is what value would you like to look up? And in this case, we'd like to look up the item name, salt. If we press comma, it asks us what table array we'd like to look in. If we come over here to the ingredient list, you'll notice that salt is listed in the very first column. Whatever value you're attempting to look up with the VLOOKUP function has to be in the first column of your table array. So if we select this entire table here, and we next press comma, and now we need to type in the index number. The index here starts with column 1, 2, 3, and 4. So whichever number we type in is the column of the information that will be returned. So for example, if we wanted to pull back the price per unit, we need to type in the number 4 because it's the fourth column in this table. The last item is asking whether we would like to use an approximate match or an exact match. In almost every scenario that you encounter, you will want to use an exact match, which means that the argument here, you can type in the word false, or alternatively, you can type the number 0, which Excel interprets as being false. Either one of those will work. And then we will close parentheses and press enter. So here, it pulls back the price per unit of salt at $4.95, which if we check here, is correct. Now if we drag this formula down, we'll notice some errors start to occur. And that's for the simple reason that we did not use any anchoring when we created this formula. So what that means is all of these references are relative references. And so whereas here we were referencing B2 through E14, as we drag that formula down, we're now referencing B6 through E18. When we create these formulas, there are parts that we want to move. For example, the lookup value we want to change as we drag it down each row. But where we look up the table array, we want to remain constant. Our column number in this simple example, we also want to remain the same, so we've hard-coded that as a 4. And the range lookup we want to be false. If you exclude this false argument here, your formula will come back with errors, although those errors will not happen every time. So you need to be cautious as you create these functions that you're always including that final optional lookup option as false. There are a couple of ways that we could fix this reference error. One of them is if we use these dollar signs here and make it an absolute reference. And then when we drag it down, it will reference correctly. But let's say instead of going all the way to row 14, let's say we started only to row 10 with our ingredients when we were first starting the company. If we drag this down, you'll notice some of those ingredients that are further down the list past row 10 just aren't going to show up in our purchase history when we do that lookup. Let's say these were ingredients that we added to the list later. Well, we don't want to have to go back and change all of our functions every time that we make updates. So we can actually use a named range. And so if we go over here and we name this ing for ingredient underscore table, we press enter. Now when we come over here, instead of referencing this long string of B2 through E10 with dollar signs, we can just type in ing_table, and now it will always reference that array. We don't have to worry about anchoring, it is automatically anchored. But, like we said, there are additional ingredients not included in that table array. We can fix that without having to change these formulas at all if we go up to the Formulas tab, choose the Name Manager, choose Edit, and then here we can change the range. And so instead of just going to row 10, I can backspace that out and go to row 14. When I click OK, you'll notice it now selects the entire table. We hit close and automatically those formulas update. So let's copy this function all the way down to the bottom. Excel's autofill feature recognized it and dragged it all the way down. But we still have some errors here. Let's take a look at this first example of an error. Here we're coming back with an NA because it can't seem to find yeast on the list. So if we go to our ingredient list, sure enough, yeast is not one of the items that we have on our list. Looking at pepperoni here, if we go over to our ingredient list, it is an item that we have on our list, but if we look very closely, it's actually spelled wrong here. So any spelling mistakes on your data that you're looking up will cause an error and it will not work. Here we have oil, and that's also showing us an error. If we look on this list, it does have oil on the list, but looking a little bit more closely here, if we click into this formula bar, there's actually an extra space that was left in here. So probably when someone typed it in, they typed oil space and then clicked enter. One of the things that we could do in our function to fix that type of mistake, because it may happen additionally down the list, is we can actually use the trim function here within our VLOOKUP so that it removes any trailing spaces when it does the lookup. And if we drag that down, it corrects that error. To fix this error here with yeast, we need to add that to our ingredient list here. We'll add it to the bottom and we'll say that the vendor is BYU Idaho in Rexburg, and let's just say that it's $4.78. Now the error still persists on this tab because our listing does not yet include that additional row. So again, we'll go to Name Manager, we'll choose to edit this to include row 15, click check, close, and now when we come to purchase history, it is in fact included. So that is our very first lookup function. Now it's important to note here that we can't just reference over to this other sheet and click this salt here and then copy it down, because salt and oil and tomato sauce and mushrooms are not in the same order here. Even though salt and oil follow each other, the other ones don't, and the purchase history is kind of randomized by day. So I guess we could go one line at a time, click equals and come over and reference this list over here to find the correct thing, and then click on that and press enter. But there's a lot of room for error in that type of work. So instead, we use these lookup functions because they look for the exact thing that we're trying to find and pull back the exact value that we need. Let's next go to the XLOOKUP function. Here, if we type in XLOOKUP, it asks again for a lookup value. Here we'll choose salt again. And remember, we learned that there may be some trailing spaces, so we'll start with the trim of that lookup term. The lookup array, in this case, is looking for a single column or a single row. And so if we come back over here to our ingredient list, the lookup array is simply this array right here. Our return array, instead of counting the number of columns, is going to be this array right here. Now the benefit of this is, what if what we were looking up were not in front of what we wanted to return? For example, what if we wanted to look up the price and return which ingredient it was, or return the vendor or the location or what have you? Now these prices may not be a unique identifier, so that may not be the best business use case, but it could be an example of how we would use this lookup function. So instead of doing the same thing, let's look up the array as our price per unit, And let's have the return array be the vendor name. And then it gives you an option. If it doesn't find anything, what would you like it to return? Well, in this case, we can put in double quotes here, nothing found. The match mode, we always want to be exact, which in this formula is the default. And then the search mode is asking you if it's a large set of data, do you have any hints for us on where we might find it? And this helps it to calculate faster with larger data sets. For this class, our data sets are not big enough for that to matter, so we will leave that argument unfilled. We'll press close parenthesis and enter. Now here nothing was found because our initial lookup value was to try to find the ingredient. If instead we want to reverse engineer and find the price per unit, we'd select this option here and press enter, and it returns our vendor name. As we drag this down, we'll run into the same issue of these lists not being anchored. So again, let's go back to this ingredient list. Here we'll call this column price. We'll call this column vendor. And now over here, instead of looking up across all of these things, we want to look up on the price array, and we want to return the vendor array. We'll press enter, and now as we drag that formula down, it fills in with no issues. So that's the XLOOKUP function. Next, what about index and match? Index and match is actually a method to do this using two different functions embedded within each other. To use this one, we'll start with the index function. And the index is actually asking you what array would you like to return. So in this case, let's actually choose a new array to return. This time we want the location. It then asks you what row number to return, and this is where we use our second embedded function of match. Match wants to know what value to look up. So if we come over here, again we want to look up the item within the array of this first column here. And the match type will be 0 or exact. And then we do a double close parentheses because we're ending both the match and the index functions at the same point. When we press enter, we see that we get that Lubbock, Texas location back for our salt. Again, a few improvements that we need to make in this. The first improvement is we need to use the trim function here to fix our data. The second improvement is we don't want to just reference these columns. Instead, we'd like to reference named ranges. So we'll name this column location, and we'll name this column ing for ingredient. So here we want to return, the very first argument here is the location. We'd like to look up the name of the item, and we'd like to look that up within the list of ingredients, and we'll press enter. As we drag that down, we can now see all of the locations. The final piece of this worksheet will be to input the total cost calculation, which is the quantity purchased multiplied by our price per unit. And we'll drag that all the way down. We'll select this, and you can use the shortcut Control-Shift-4 to put it in currency format. On our summary sheet, we're going to have a couple of input cells. First, we want the ingredient. Second, we'd like to understand what of these things would you like to know, and so we'll call that information. Here we'll choose to insert some data validation. We'll use the data tab and come over here to data validation. We'll allow a list, and remember we created that named range for ingredients, ing. That allows us to now choose an ingredient. We'll use on the Home tab these cell styles, and we'll choose Input. And then for information here, we'll also use some data validation. But this time when we choose the list, we'll go over to our ingredient list, and we'll choose whether we want the vendor, the location, or the price per unit. We'll click OK, and again we'll format this as an input. Here we'll type in the result. And in this case, we'll format it with the output style. We'll use the HLOOKUP function. and H stands for horizontal lookup. So the lookup value is going to be this location option here. The table array will be from our ingredient list, this entire table. And remember that we named it, Excel automatically remembered that name as ingredient table. It then wants to know the row index number. So which row down are we going to? If we wanted this row here for flour, we could type in row number 2. And again, we want to use false or 0 for an exact match. And we'll press enter. So it's pulling back the location in the second row, right here. If we wanted it to pull back the location for the tomato sauce vendor, we would need to include tomato sauce in our formula here somehow. And that would be in this argument here for the row index number. We'll use the match function, and the lookup value will be that tomato sauce. And the lookup array will be over here on an ingredient list table, this entire column here. And the match type will be 0. We'll close that parenthesis and click enter. So tomato sauce location is Sacramento, California. And if we double check that, that is correct. If we choose, instead of wanting to know the location, the vendor name, you'll see it's moved over one column to the left. So HLOOKUP is about a horizontal lookup. VLOOKUP is about a vertical lookup. Let's finish up our summary sheet with a couple of other bits of information. Using the lookup function, we may want to have a static ability to pull back, for example, the total cost of things that we've purchased. So over here, we'll say total cost, and we'll format it the same way that we have this price per unit formatted. Here we'll use a SUMIFS formula, and the sum range will be this total cost here. The criteria range will be the item name, and then the criteria will be back over here, the name of that particular row. We'll close parentheses and press enter. On our dashboard, we will say total cost, and now we want to do a lookup function here. We're going to do it 3 different ways. So here I'll write VLOOKUP, then I'll write XLOOKUP, and then I'll write index match. We'll format all of these as outputs, and we'll format these as explanatory notes. We'll put up here pizza company lookup. We'll format this across the top here as a heading. We'll make the row height a little bit taller. We'll move this column width in a bit, expand this column width a bit, and then we're going to hide the rest of these. We'll also go to the View tab, and we'll turn off the ability to see grid lines. Very first formula equals VLOOKUP. The lookup value is going to be the ingredient here. The table array is this entire table. Remember, we've added a column, so we can't use our named range this time. The column index number is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the range lookup is always false. Now using XLOOKUP, we will look up this value. The lookup array will be over here. The return array will be over here. And then if it's not found, we'll say not found. And then we'll choose again 0 for exact match, and we'll close parentheses, press enter. And then the final version is index and match. Remember, index starts with what array would you like to return, which is this one. And then we need to figure out which row number. We do that by using the match function. And the lookup value is going to be this. The lookup array for that value will be our ingredient column. And we want an exact match. We'll close parentheses, and you'll see here are 3 different ways that you can get to the same type of information. Lookup functions are some of the most valuable and powerful functions that Excel has to offer, because you can combine information across different worksheets either on a dashboard or within embedded data tables. You will need to practice these in order to get the hang of how they work and to be confident in correcting errors that come up. Over the course of the projects and practices that we do, I would invite you to please try out using the different methods that we've demonstrated here today so that you can be comfortable with any and all of them.